Hello, my name is Sean Briscoe, and in this presentation I will introduce you to the event known as Student Congress or Congressional Debate. This format of debate is loosely modeled on what we would hope to see on the floor of the United States Congress. The students will enter the chamber and debate various pieces of bills and resolutions, going back and forth, arguing the pro and the con, and during that process they're going to follow parliamentary procedure. There will be a presiding officer who is usually a competitive or a student competitor who's helping to ensure a fair division of speeches, helping to ensure an efficient chamber so that we can maximize the number of speeches and those types of things. But just like bills and resolutions in Congress, bills would have the weight of law behind them, and resolutions would be statements of principle or statements that the chamber, the legislative body, hopes to promote. And what's interesting about this format of debate is that it allows students to pick when they speak. It allows to pick the side that they are going to speak on and those types of things, which is very different than you see in other formats of debate. In that, in most formats of debate, students are told which sides to argue, but in congressional debate, they get to pick which side. Now, that still doesn't mean that those students are necessarily arguing from their own personal beliefs or their own personal convictions. You will find that some competitors will choose which side they're going to defend strategically. Perhaps there's an imbalance in the chamber between the number of people who support a piece of legislation, and so they may choose to negate the resolution or negate the piece of legislation as a way of ensuring that they get a speech on the topic. Or maybe most of the material has already been covered on the side that they actually agree with, and so they're going to speak up on the other side so that they can have that opportunity to debate. Ultimately then, this format of debate really isn't any different than anything else, in that we're hoping that our students are taking advantage of the opportunity to see both sides of an issue, to learn how to critically analyze ideas, and progress from there. And then at the end of it, or not at the end of the session, but at the end of each piece of legislation, the students will actually move previous question and vote on the legislation. So they would choose to either pass or not pass a bill or a resolution. It should be noted, though, that that doesn't really factor into your decision as a judge. You aren't really evaluating whether or not students are effective at convincing the chamber to pass a piece of legislation, although I suppose you could if you really wanted to. You're still evaluating students' ability to present their ideas clearly and to debate better than the other people in the chamber. Now, over the course of a congressional debate, you will see three types of speeches. The first is the authorship speech or the sponsorship speech. That is the first pro speech or the first affirmative speech in the debate. So the very first thing you will hear is someone introducing a piece of legislation. The vast majority of speeches are just constructive speeches going back and forth between the pro and the con side of the topic. And then finally, there would be a summary speech or a whip speaker who would try and drum up support and analyze everything. And I'm going to look at each of these three types of speeches in turn. So that authorship sponsorship speech, that individual is trying to prospectively frame the debate. They're trying to let you know what the key issues are surrounding that piece of legislation. Why are we debating this topic? Why should this topic matter? And what are the most salient arguments related to the debate? Why, in fact, should we pass this legislation? So they're going to introduce us to the debate topic. And again, that's just the very first speech that you hear. After that, the vast majority of speeches are going to be standard constructive speeches. And there are two duties associated with each constructive speech. So that would be the first negative speech, the second affirmative, the second negative, the third affirmative, the third negative, the fourth affirmative, the fourth negative, and however long the debate goes on, you're going to hear them going back and forth. But all of these speeches are going to have two elements. One, the first element is that they need to answer the previous speaker. Typically, an individual will only spend about 30 seconds or so of his or her speech time deconstructing that previous speaker. They're going to try and find the weakest link or the weakest part of the previous speaker's argument and undermine it, show why that isn't a compelling argument. They may at times go back and reach to even earlier speeches if they felt that someone gave a speech and no one really deconstructed or no one really answered that person's arguments. They may reach back and answer some of those as well. But after they've done that deconstruction phase, then they need to add something new to the debate. And ultimately, that's how you know if they're contributing to a good debate, is by looking at what they're actually adding. How are they helping us to understand this topic better? And there are several ways that they can add something new to the debate. They can add a new pragmatic argument. Maybe previously speakers had talked about environmental aspects and public health aspects, and now they're going to add in an economics-based argument. Okay, there are many different pragmatic types of arguments. The results of the policy, the results of the policy which can be analyzed. And that's really the type of thing that you would see if you were judging policy debate at a tournament, where you look at the actual results of a plan. A second way that they could add something new is to add a new philosophical principle. Help us to understand why it should matter to us, what the ultimate goals are, and why that should be the driving principle behind our decisions. If you judge other formats of debate, that's what you would see in Lincoln Douglas. They also could add something new by talking about the theoretical structures. Maybe they know a lot about international relations theory or sociology theory, and so they can go in and they can explain the theory that leads us to understand that pragmatic result that was talked about in an earlier speech. Or they might examine the resolution or the legislation through a case study. Maybe something similar has been done in a certain part of the world, in a state, in another era in time, and they examine that case study to help us understand how the legislation would affect future situations or affect the future. And then they could just take a hypothetical application and say, look, if we do this, we can understand what's going to happen by hypothetically applying it to a specific scenario in the world. So maybe if the legislation was changing our defense policy or something like that, they could create a scenario to say this is what would happen if we passed this piece of legislation. But ultimately, you then are looking at how did they contribute to the debate, how did they contribute to our understanding of this issue. And of course, the next speaker is going to answer that new material and then add their own material to the debate. And then the third type of speech is the summary speech, or the whip speaker. Most often you have one pro speaker and one negative speaker who will summarize the debate. Occasionally, if the debate has progressed through several cycles, maybe we've had 8 or 9 affirmative and 8 or 9 negative speeches on a particular piece of legislation, you may find that it actually takes 2 speakers on each side to give that summary speech. In part, that's a lot of speeches, but also keep in mind that all of the speeches in congressional debate are 3 minutes in length, and so it might be very difficult to summarize all of the debate that's transpired in a single 3-minute speech. And so the debaters then may end up having 2 affirmative speakers summarize the debate and 2 negative speakers summarize the debate. How will you know when it's time for a summary? Well, there are some debaters out there who actually excel at giving summary speeches. They can observe the chamber and they can identify when debate is starting to get stale, when people are starting to be repetitive in their argumentation, and so they'll find that as the perfect opportunity to stand up and summarize the debate. And sometimes students are just really knowledgeable about a particular issue, and so if they know all of the main arguments on a piece of legislation, they will be able to identify when it's time for debate to end, and they may give that summary speech. Pretty much what you would see in that summary speech, hopefully the debater would look back and identify all of the central principles that have been brought out on both sides of the topic, and also the critical arguments that have been brought out by various speakers. And then they can encapsulate the significant aspects of the debate into a digestible perspective, and they may spend some time also creating a hierarchy of issues, helping to engage. If you've seen some of the other presentations that I put up, this would be the area where they start engaging in vertical debate, where they compare the different issues to one another and help you to understand which argument is the most important. And then you would know if they've done a good job at their summary by A, Have they actually correctly identified the central principles and critical arguments in the debate? Are they giving appropriate credit to the speakers in the chamber who developed those ideas, or are they catering to their friends, which you wouldn't know, but you can look back and go, yes, you're identifying the main arguments and you're doing a good job, or hey, I think you missed the boat on this, and so you aren't giving an effective summary of this particular debate round. It's also important to realize that the presiding officer plays a very important role in the chamber. Most tournaments will have a student competitor serving as the presiding officer. And that presiding officer, that student, should be factored into your rankings at the end of the day. Okay? Even though they're not giving a speech, they play an important role because they're ensuring a fair chamber, meaning that you want to ensure that the presiding officer isn't playing favorites, that they're actually ensuring that everyone has an equal opportunity to give speeches, and also promoting an efficient chamber, ensuring that we progress through so that we can maximize the number of speeches given during that 1 hour or 3 hour session, however long the congressional session has been scheduled for. The presiding officer wants to ensure that they have an efficient chamber so you can maximize the number of speeches. If things are getting bogged down in procedural issues, if there's a lot of dead time between speeches, that may be the presiding officer's fault. Now, sometimes you have an unruly chamber and there's just not a lot that the presiding officer can do, but you should be able to look around and see if it's the fault of the presiding officer or if it's some members of the chamber who are causing the problem, and evaluate that. In the end, a presiding officer is typically ranked in the final ranking. So you'll have a chamber of 10, 15, 30 students. And at the end of the session, you will have to identify the top 8 contributors. Most tournaments have you identify the top 8 contributors, and you rank order them 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th. Presiding officers are almost always ranked on that sheet because they have a critical role. Because they're not giving speeches, in my experience, they are very rarely ranked in the top 2 and only occasionally ranked in the top 3 or the 3rd place position. But they are usually ranked at the end of the round. And so what then is your role as the judge? You are evaluating the overall contributions of all of the members of the chamber. Did they actually help us understand the debate by effectively deconstructing the previous speaker? Did they add some new knowledge to the debate, or did they just rehash what was said earlier? Or did they only give lip service to the issues? Did they spread themselves too thin and simply identify a whole bunch of arguments without really adding understanding to those arguments? Okay, you can look at their argumentation to see if they're promoting good debate. Are they being genuine in their questions during cross-examination periods? Are they disruptive to the chamber? Are they helping to ensure that we have an efficient chamber? Are they helping to ensure that people who haven't given a speech are able to give a speech if they want to, and those types of things? Okay, and you look at everyone in the chamber and you say, who did the most to contribute to a good debate? Those individuals should go on your ballot, identifying the top 8, and then rank order them 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th through 8th place. So let's look at what a debate might look like in congressional debate. If you had a piece of legislation saying that we should incorporate corporal punishment in our schools, probably not an actual piece of legislation that you would have, because most tournaments, the students are actually more or less role-playing as though they are the United States Congress, and so this isn't an issue that would usually, it's not a piece of legislation that would typically be passed or evaluated in Congress. But for sake of argument and illustrating what might happen in a debate, is you could have a piece of legislation saying, hey, let's have corporal punishment in schools. That sponsorship speech is going to spend a little bit of time explaining the legislation, although they don't necessarily need to do that because it's in front of you and you can read it. The students all have it in front of them so they can read it. It might be important for the sponsor, though, to identify some of the key components of the legislation, maybe help us understand what some of the terms in the legislation are referring to so that we're all on the same page. But in this particular debate, the individual has presented 2 constructive arguments in his 3-minute speech. First, he says that we need to ensure a safe learning environment, that in our schools we need to focus on learning outcomes. And so he presents an argument talking about using the spare the rod, spoil the child phrase, also talking about the importance of deterrence, that if we have this threat of corporal punishment in our schools, it would deter students from acting out, and then teachers can actually focus on learning outcomes. And then second, the individual gave a little bit of time on student safety, just talking about promoting safety within the schools. But what I'm guessing from this slide is that the individual started to run out of time, couldn't really develop that point, but wanted to ensure prospectively that everyone was aware of what the two main issues on this piece of legislation would be. The first, learning outcomes, and the second, student safety. Then we would move to the first negative speech, or the first con speech. And this individual is going to, first of all, of course, deconstruct the previous point. There's an efficacy or a solvency attack saying that, hey, this isn't going to be an effective way of promoting safety and safe learning outcomes in our school. And she gives us two reasons behind it. The first is based on the idea of how the legislation was written, that there had to be a referral process, an investigation, and then the corporal punishment, the spanking or whatever it is, would be handed out at a later time. And so she points out that, hey, the lack of immediacy means that you're not actually deterring anything, students aren't necessarily thinking about it. And second, she says there's a problem because you start to set up a fear of school in the minds of students. But then she adds to the debate, adds to the understanding of the debate, by having her own constructive point about a cycle of violence that is created. That when we have corporal punishment in our schools, it tells students that violence is okay, and that the person who's bigger or stronger or in a position of power can use their physical strength to control other individuals. Okay, so, and that's where the power relationships comes in. And then she starts to talk about how that plays out in terms of domestic violence throughout our society. So once her 3-minute speech is over, then we'll move into the second pro speech. And of course, this individual is going to deconstruct that previous speaker by saying, well, look, this is only going to be an option of last resort. So we're not going to create a cycle of violence. We're talking about a situation where students have used violence against other students and not just using it willy-nilly or at the drop of a hat in order to control our students. So it's not likely that you're going to create the cycle of violence. And then also brings in the idea of this is how our society works. Our criminal justice system is based on the same sort of investigative process, due process, and then doling out punishments. But then the speaker decided to go back to that student safety point that the sponsor of the legislation hinted at, but develops the point by saying that one of the primary roles of our schools is to ensure a safe learning environment, but also the safety of our students, that our schools act as caregivers in the absence of the parent, and develops this point by pointing to the dire circumstances in our schools, how much violence there actually is in our schools, how much bullying there is in our schools, and then possibly even talking about some of the bigger situations, school shootings and that types of things. And then also, the speaker develops a point about how we're unlikely to create a fear of school because schools build relationships first, that our educators are spending a lot of time ensuring that they develop a community within the classroom and having positive relationships with students so that we can progress forward and promote safety in our schools even though we're incorporating corporal violence. And then the second con speaker is going to come in and say, look, you're getting minimal gains in safety and learning outcomes. The scenarios that you're describing, while there might be some benefit, arguably it would be small, and so it's not all that important. But then adds to the debate by developing this cycle of violence point even more, talking about the long-term implications. So probably what happened in this debate is the first speaker on the negative side developed the power relationships aspect and the idea that violence is okay, and hinted at domestic violence, but now this speaker is going to really develop what that cycle of violence would look like as our students transition into the workforce, into social spheres, into the family, and so forth, and talking about the violence that we perpetuate in our society. Then we'll move back to the affirmative side. Again, they deconstruct by saying, look, none of that cycle of violence is going to be a problem if we solve the violence early in the schools, and then we no longer have to worry about the problems in the long term. We stop students from behaving badly. And then the speaker has decided to add to the debate by developing a point on justice, to talk about how justice is the foundation of modern society, and the way that we promote a just society is by institutionalizing those concepts and teaching those concepts. And again, then part of our school's primary function is actually to develop, or one of the primary functions of schools is to develop responsible citizenship. And so we teach our students what the criminal justice system looks like by following these models of referral and investigation with due process and then punishments. And so this speaker is saying that the piece of legislation is modeled on the U.S. criminal justice system, and that helps to develop responsible citizens who understand the justice system once they've graduated. Then the third speaker on the negative side comes in and says, look, you have a fatal assumption here. All of your arguments are contingent upon the belief that it will actually work. You're presuming that it will actually solve, that it will be effective, but it simply will not work. You are not getting the outcomes you want in the school, and so therefore you're never going to get those long-term benefits that you're claiming. And then the person develops a social psychology point talking about why the perpetuation of violence is going to occur and why we're going to have fear. And this individual refers to behaviorists like Skinner and talking about reinforcement, how we end up associating different things and act out on it and continue to do it later on in life and those types of things. Violence becomes second nature to us, and that becomes our behavior. Also talking about instilling fear. The Watson study where they played loud noise with white rats being in the room and babies cried, and then they removed the loud noise, but anytime the white rat was put in front of the child screamed, even though there was nothing to scare them at that point because of that association. And so the speaker then is developing a point on corporal punishment, saying that what you're doing is you are associating the administrators within the school as someone to be feared. And that creates a culture in which students do not go to administrators, do not work with administrators, do not see them as allies, but as enemies, as someone to be feared, and then they shut down in our schools, and we actually don't get any of the gains that you are hoping to get on the affirmative side of this piece of legislation. Then we move back to the pro side, and we have a summary speech. That individual needs to deconstruct the previous speaker, just like all of the other speakers, but then she's going to summarize the debate. And she basically looks at those 6 speeches that came prior, the 3 pro and the 3 con speeches, and says, look, there are 2 main questions. The first is whether or not corporal punishment leads to violence or a safe learning environment. And then she's going to analyze which side is correct on that issue. And then she says, second, who best promotes justice in our society? Justice in terms of the immediate situation in our schools, but also in long term. Okay, she summarized the debate presumably in favor of the affirmative. And then there's going to be a negative summary speaker who says, first, does violence beget violence? And of course, since they're on the con side, this speaker is going to say, all you're doing is creating a cycle of violence where students act out against other students, they act out against other people after school, later in life, and so forth. And the second summary point that this speaker comes up with is a question of what best leads to social harmony. Will students internalize the principles of justice, as the affirmative claims, or are they just learning to fear the system? And again, since the speaker is on the negative, the answer to those 2 questions, we're presuming she's going to do a good job of explaining why the negative has won the debate on that piece of legislation. Once those speeches are over, we're probably done with this piece of legislation. Someone would move previous question, and they would vote to either pass or not pass the legislation. If there's still time remaining in the chamber, they would move to another piece of legislation, and the debate would progress just like it did on this one. And then once the session is over, you'll take your ballot, and you'll think about who did the most to contribute to a good debate, and rank order those debaters 1st through 8th. And again, don't forget that presiding officer plays an important role in the debate as well.